it's me, Laurel Ann, and I'm here with a wrap-up today of all the books that I read in November and December. It feels very strange, I'm not gonna lie, to be talking about books that I read in November because, as we all know, that was 20 years ago. I don't know what it is about this time of year or that time of year. November and December are just never particularly fruitful reading months for me, so I'm glad that I left them for like a combined wrap up, because otherwise I would have had just a couple of books in two separate videos. I think this one is going to be kind of quick. I'm not feeling particularly chatty. Also, the last time I tried to sit down and film this video, a coup attempt happened, so I better make it snappy before I cause any other national crises. The first book I finished in November was Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. This is about a 25-year-old woman named Samira who lives in Philadelphia, and she is currently working as a part-time babysitter for this wealthy white woman, Alix, and her daughter, Briar. Things kind of kick off one night when Alix has some kind of emergency in her home, and she called Samira over and just asks her to take Briar out of the house. She takes her to a local grocery store, and Samira is accused of having kidnapped Briar because she's a black woman and Briar is a white child. And things just sort of escalate from there. Alix becomes weirdly obsessed with Samira, not in a like misery Kathy Bates way, but just in that she feels so much guilt about causing this incident to happen that she takes it upon herself to really try and improve Samira's life. There's also a guy named Kelly who ends up filming the incident in the grocery store, and he and Samira start a relationship as he tries to encourage her to make the video public, and she doesn't want to. This book is truly as amazing as everyone says it is. It is so light and fun and action-packed and quick and enjoyable, but also so densely packed with stuff. I don't know that any other novel has made me think quite so much this year. It's really just a pretty amazing feat. Alix and Kelly are these two sort of opposite parodies of white wokeness and how that intersects with racism. There's this other theme that I find very interesting that I haven't really heard discussed as much about the American obsession with ambition and productivity. Samira is constantly being pushed by people in her life to go out and do more, to have more drive in her career, to do bigger things. But she's perfectly happy to just work part-time as a babysitter. She just wants to live her life and have something that pays the bills. And I think that this book does a really good job of showing that ambition and self-worth are not the same thing, and that productivity under capitalism is not the ultimate echelon of goodness, paragon of goodness. What am I even saying? I also think, as somebody who has worked with children, she does a really good job of tapping into that particular melancholy of having this really close relationship with a child that doesn't belong to you and who will forget you when you leave, or when they leave. And yeah, I don't know, there's just so much to love about this book. It was so me. It really reminded me of like Celeste Ng or other sort of upmarket fiction, but it's just like the best of that particular marketing category. Is there anything else I want to say about it? No, go read it if you haven't yet. I know that you've heard about it so many times, and I can tell you that the hype is deserved. Next, I read The Covent Garden Ladies by Hallie Rubenhold. This is nonfiction about the sex trade in London during the Georgian era, and it focuses on the lives of three prominent players in that industry. There is a woman who was a sort of famous sex worker and kept woman who later went on to run kind of a chain of brothels, really. There is a writer who made a lot of money by writing a catalog of all of the sex workers that were available for hire in London. And then this other guy who was basically like just a pimp. I don't know if there's like a correct term for that, let me know. This was certainly very interesting, and there were a lot of things in the story that I was really drawn to. I also really enjoyed hearing more about the societal attitudes at the time towards sex and sex work. I thought that was very interesting, and I think it also added for me some context to some of the other books and media that I really enjoy. For example, I've recently started watching Bridgerton, which so far is just okay, but it's really interesting with the context of what I learned from the Covent Garden ladies to sort of think about how the portrayal of these people maybe doesn't fully line up with like what the truth was about how they would have thought about sex and what they would have known about sex. But I also overall was left with a pretty bad taste in my mouth. Like, first of all, this isn't that bad, but there were some just organizational issues in this book. I felt like there were certain plot points that were kind of cycled through. It was told in a really weird alinear way where it would tell me right when a character is introduced how they were going to die and what their big accomplishment was going to be. And so then when it came up in the narrative, I was really confused because I kind of was thinking that it had already happened. So that was just kind of disappointing. But what really bothered me was just, it had like a very judgmental and moralistic tone, which really surprised me because from what I know of Hallie Rubenhold and her work, her whole ethos seems to be giving voices to women who at the time were voiceless and whose voices have been forgotten. And yet in this book, she constantly throws around terms like harlot and fallen woman and loss of virtue. And at first, I thought that she was just trying to use more of the language of the time and kind of help us get into that mindset. But by the end, I don't know, I just felt like there was a lot of commentary that was like, look at these women, can you believe they would debase themselves so much? And it wasn't really until the final chapters that she acknowledged that for a lot of women, this was their only choice. It was basically homelessness or sex work. And so many of the stories that she told were women who were tricked or kidnapped into this trade, which I'm sure did happen, but I don't think it was everybody. In fact, I know it was not everybody. So yeah, just kind of a weird one. It did come out in 2005, and obviously we're having much different conversations about sex now than we were in 2005. But I just was very unpleasantly surprised by this. I can't say I recommend it, really, unfortunately. The next book I read was Know My Name by Chanel Miller. If you don't know, Chanel Miller was the victim of Brock Turner in the infamous Stanford rape case, and this is her memoir of the events of that night, the aftermath, the trial, and her journey of taking the first steps toward healing. I honestly am going to have a really hard time expressing my feelings about this because it's so good. I think it's probably the best memoir I've ever read. I thought it was going to be an eye-opening experience. I thought I was going to see her story and understand a different side of something that we heard about in the news for so many months. But this is so much more than that. Chanel Miller is an unreal writer. Every sentence, I felt like my jaw was dropping open because it was just so gorgeously written. She encapsulates so much pain and so much hope in this book. It's honestly mind-blowingly good, and I really hope that she writes more. I think she will. She kind of alluded to it in the later chapters, and she called this her first book. So that does give me a lot of hope that she will someday write fiction or maybe another memoir. I don't know, but honestly, run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore to pick up a copy of this or listen to the audiobook. I did like a combo, and the audiobook is read by Chanel herself. That adds a really good layer to the story as well, because of course it's in her own voice. Sometimes she gets emotional. It's just so good. Obviously, big content warnings for the obvious topic. Don't pick this up if it might be triggering for you, but if you think you might be able to make it through this without having a bad reaction, then you should. Okay. Then I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was a reread for me, but I first read it in high school and I honestly did not remember that much. I also did this as a buddy read with Hillary. We kind of failed because we read them at like different times, but I really enjoyed hearing her thoughts in her wrap up, and some of what she said kind of, I think, improved my reading of this. So I will link her video in the places and you can watch that as well. So Rebecca, of course, is the story of an unnamed young woman who marries a troubled, wealthy widower named Mr. De Winter, Maxim De Winter. And after a wonderful honeymoon, she goes back to his house with him and things are immediately worse. He has this really weird housekeeper named Mrs. Danvers who seems obsessed with his dead wife. She's constantly feeling like everyone is judging her. She just feels completely uncomfortable in her own skin and in her marriage, and socially incompetent in every way, until she learns something that changes everything in her life for the better. It's not for the better, but for her it feels better, basically. Look, it's a crowd favorite for a reason. The writing is unbelievably good. There were so many times where it's just like, oh, this is making me feel bad about my own skills because it's so good. And the setting is on point. I think that what I missed the first time around that I picked up on this time is the themes of mental health. There are so many things that the protagonist reacts to and ways she reacts that you think, well, this is ridiculous. Nobody would ever think this way. But if you think about it in terms of her suffering with anxiety and depression, it starts to make sense. This is Gothic literature at its best. There are some very obvious parallels to be drawn with Jane Eyre, although I think it is a very updated take on it with some much more modern themes, which is remarkable considering that this came out in the 30s. I'm like 99% sure. I'm gonna look it up though. 1938. So Daphne, you were really on it. This is a slow burn, and I think it's best enjoyed slowly savored, which of course is not everybody's cup of tea, but if you are into that kind of thing, you really can't go wrong with Rebecca. Next up is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. V.E. Schwab, if I'm being honest, is an author that I never was interested in picking up, but for some reason there was something about this book that just called to me. I started reading it basically the day it came out or the week it came out, which I never do. My experience was largely positive. If you somehow have been tapped out of book internet for the last 2 months, you will not know that Addie LaRue is the story of a young woman born in the late 17th century who makes a deal with the devil that she will live forever essentially, but everyone she meets will forget about her as soon as she leaves their sight. She lives like this for about 300 years until one day somebody does remember her. And if you're a real big smart boy, you might be able to guess what happens next. I think the concept is quite strong. It's got a very fanciful and moody atmosphere. And there is prose in here that truly is stunning. However, I've got some gripes. So first of all, the pacing, I'm just like not really sure about it. The first half is extremely slow and sensuous and repetitive. There are lots and lots of chapters that are used simply to show us that everyone forgets her. And honestly, I got it the first time. I'm kind of the opposite of most people in that I enjoyed the first half of the book a lot more than the second half when the plot starts. But even then, I could recognize the repetition and the repetitive nature of it as being annoying, but I liked it because I like when nothing is happening. Another issue I have is that the historical sections just didn't feel particularly well drawn, and frankly I felt like they were totally unresearched. Not that I noticed any glaring anachronisms, but there just wasn't anything that really gave me a sense of time and place. I mean, we spend lots and lots, probably a third of this book in 18th century France, and honestly you could have just told me it's 1930s France and I would have said, okay, that stacks up for me. The third issue I have is the writing. Oh, but I thought you said that the prose was stunning. I did, and it is. However, she definitely falls into this trap where she finds some images and similes that she really loves, and she just uses them to death. I understand if you come up with a really pleasant image that you like a lot, you want to take advantage of it. But when you have so many characters in your world using the same simile, it just doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, even though I enjoyed this book and I kept wanting to go back to it when I wasn't reading it, I was really excited to pick it back up, the farther away I get from it, the more I don't like it. So that's Addie LaRue, unfortunately. I totally get what other people see in it. It's just not for me. The next book I read was Clariel by Garth Nix. This is a prequel to the Old Kingdom trilogy that I reread in a vlog back in April, I think. This is, I guess, YA fantasy about a young woman named Clariel who is moved by her family to a new city from this like woodland village that she grew up in, and she just really doesn't like it. All she wants to do is go back to the forest and become a ranger, basically. For probably 80 to 90% of this book, I was completely in love with it. It felt so nice to be back in a world that was familiar to me. I thought that he was tackling some really interesting issues in this. It focuses a lot on political intrigue, which is sort of absent from the original trilogy. There was some interesting commentary about capitalism and class divisions that I really appreciated. And there was a moment when I realized how this is related to the previous books, and I was totally just floored. I really thought that it was going to end up being an extremely dark ending, and I was kind of excited for it, kind of dreading it. And then I think in the ending, the book sort of walks that back. It really can't decide what it wants to be. Is this a hero's journey with a triumphant ending, or is this a tragic villain origin story? And it turns out it's both, and that indecision just sort of undermined both readings of the text. And so at the end, I just really wish that it had decided what it wanted to be instead of trying to do both things. But still, as far as prequels go, it was pretty good, and it was a fun experience. Okay, and then the very last thing I read in the year of 2020 was Coriander by Sally Gardner. This again is a reread of a childhood favorite. When I was reorganizing my bookshelves, I was looking at this and I was just like, dang, that's a good cover. And I remembered loving it so much, so I decided I would reread it. This is about a teenage girl named Coriander growing up in the 1640s, right around the time of the English Civil War. And when her perfect, wonderful, beloved mother dies, her father remarries this horrible Puritan woman who basically has like a cultish adoration of this Puritan minister who moves into their house and decides that Coriander is a witch. You might have some guesses of where it goes from there, and you'd be wrong, actually. This was an interesting reading experience for me because when I first started out, I was really actually getting nervous and thinking, dang, I really should have left this in my childhood. For one thing, Coriander's wealthy father is feeling persecuted by the growing parliamentarian movement in England, and I was kind of like, questioning that choice, like, oh no, poor rich boy. And I also was getting really confused by what was happening. So in my recollection, I thought that this was pretty much historical fiction with some fabulism or magical realism, but it is just straight up a fairy tale. And once I wrapped my head around that little fact, I was able to enjoy this a lot more. There was a reason I wasn't connecting with the characters on an emotional level, and it was that. Nothing really makes sense, and that, I think, is deliberate. So this is kind of a weird one because I don't think anyone's gonna read this book, but if you are interested, I actually would recommend it. I think it's good fun, kind of a weird one, but yeah. Wow, those were words that came out of my mouth, and now they are done. Thanks for being here. If you made it to the end, give me an emoji. Let me think about which one. I'm gonna look at them. Oh, give me the champagne emoji because it's a new year. Hooray. I hope you all are surviving. I am going to be putting out my least favorites and favorites over the next few weeks. Probably by the time I get them up, no one will care anymore, but I just need to move at my own pace. Some of these books will show up on some of those lists. So can you guess which ones? Let me know in the comments below. As well as the little champagne thing, if you feel like it. If you don't, no worries. It never gets any easier, does it? Okay, that's all. Have a good day. Bye. No, I was going to burn the book. You're very handsome.